Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. In the face of conspiracy theories and social media-driven paranoia, the baseline confidence in American elections is in a precarious spot. In New Hampshire, officials have done their best to push back on falsehoods and be open and transparent about the process here. This year, a new effort is being launched to try to restore trust nationwide, and two leaders of that movement, a couple of WMUR political interview veterans from a few years back, are here. Former U.S. Senator John E. Sununu and former Congressman Dick Swett. Gentlemen,
great to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about this Democracy Defense Project, what it's doing, and why you got involved, Senator.
Sure. You know, you said to protect democracy or protect elections. It's really about promoting and supporting public confidence in elections. And there are lots of ways you can do that. But you want to explain to people, how the process works and push back on concepts that just aren't true. And inaccurate, so that people understand how the count takes place, what kind of standards are in place to protect the integrity of voter rolls, to protect the integrity of the process, whether it's absentee voting or voting in a polling place, and just help give people more confidence in the election process. That obviously, we've all seen, not just over the last 4 years, but we go back 8, 10 years, 12 years, people don't have as much confidence in the process as they used to, and that's simply not good for America, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
What about you, Congressman?
The foundation of a strong democracy it rests on the election process. And if you don't have a confidence building electoral process, then people are not going to believe that that democracy really has validity. And so we're in the process of, number one, as John says, making sure people understand how that electoral process is conducted. But also we have to build that conducting in such a way that it's transparent to everybody and everyone sees that their vote, that democratic vote, has value and that it's being counted properly, and in the tallying of those votes they know who the winner is and who the loser is, and they can move forward with the democratic processes of running the government. So it's an important foundational building block that has to be in place.
We've seen partisanship and political divisions exacerbate over the last few years. How do you break down that partisan wall, especially when partisans on both sides, and you're here together, are seeing this from such different viewpoints, Congressman?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to recognize that you can disagree without being disagreeable. I mean, I have great respect for John. I have great respect for many, many people on the Republican side. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything that they say, but it does mean that I can have really interesting and productive conversations about what we can do to help this country and help this country improve and get past these difficult times that we find ourselves in. And so I think it starts with that respect, and after that, then it's willing to listen to opinions that may not agree with yours, but then working together to figure out what are the best points of those discussions that actually solve the problems that we're confronted with.
I believe there's probably a similar, but what about you, Senator, in terms of breaking down that partisan wall?
Oh, very much so, but I think it starts with going out, speaking to the public, and finding out where the consensus really is. I mean, one of the things that we did as part of this organization is conduct polling in New Hampshire to talk about the things that reinforce public confidence in elections, and to sort of understand where there might be problems, where people might not have confidence. So, just asking questions like, should we have paper ballots? Do you support the idea of paper ballots where you have always a hard record if you need to do a recount? Scores very high. Purging voter rolls on a regular basis to make sure that people who have passed away or people who aren't citizens aren't on the voter rolls. Scores very high. And in fact, these, among other ideas and recommendations, were reinforced by the bipartisan commission Congressman Swett was part of, that had hearings all over the state and looked at ways to continue to improve New Hampshire's election processes. They came up with a number of recommendations, and some of them were recently enacted into law with the support of the Secretary of State. Sweet, who really felt strongly as a leader of that committee that this would continue to help improve the election process in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and we know you guys through politics, but I think you're an engineer and you're an architect.
I'm an architect.
So you guys see these systems. Congressman Sweat, I mean, Senator Sununu brought up some changes. What do you think would be some substantive changes that could help improve confidence?
Well, I think first and foremost is we have to figure out a way to get people more involved in monitoring the elections. New Hampshire does it the right way. We have election monitors. We have people from the local communities in their gymnasiums, in their town halls, in their voting locations, running those elections. And they know who comes in through the door. Everybody is familiar with everybody else. It's a scale issue. So if you scale it down to where you have people who are familiar and from the community participating in that community, that's a big step in the right direction.
You know, obviously this all happens on a continuum, and you know, we have Democrats questioning election results in 2000, 2004, and 2016. It's safe to say Donald Trump took it to the next level in 2020. What is the Democracy Defense Project going to do, Senator Sununu, first to you, if Donald Trump decides to do something similar again in November?
Sure. Well, whether Democrat or Republican, you know, anyone post-election that's putting out ideas or conspiracy theories that are patently false, I think on a bipartisan basis, the organization would step up and try to help communicate, you know, what's true, what's not true, and disseminating good information, being honest, being clear about what did and didn't happen is, I think, part of the process of restoring public confidence. So I don't think the organization would shy away from being clear about what was factually accurate and what was inaccurate. You know, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be able to use the process for reviewing votes, for recounting votes. That's important. But it's when people go so far as to just say things that are patently false, that are provably false, that's not really helping anyone in the election process, and it's certainly not helping to make the public confident about the election process.
Yeah, we have to first start from the basis point of how do we build confidence back into our system. People are mistrusting government. They don't feel that the process is a legitimate process. And as John says, some are making patently false accusations that can be provenly that they're false. And so in the process of doing that, we've got to make sure that we say, okay, we've established this level of confidence, we've established this level of fact, now let's move on. How do we build to where we're back in an operating mode where we can go on from an election without having these kinds of attacks being thrown at each other. So I think the biggest problem that we've got to address is how do we rebuild people's trust in government, and that is going to take a step-by-step action where we're looking at one decision, how does that help, how does that hinder, and then move from there. And ultimately, I think it's going to take not this election, it's going to take several elections with organizations like the DDP really focusing on opening up and making transparent that process and getting people to understand, yes, they were right about this issue and it needs to be corrected, or maybe, yes, they were wrong about this issue and they need to adjust their analysis and their thinking on that point.
And as we wrap up here, Senator, how much of this do you think is just a byproduct of, you know, the Congressman mentioned it could take several elections. We've had so many close elections, that sort of almost just opens the door to this kind of stuff in some ways.
Yes, but I think you hit on it. You know, it was people in 2000, 2004, 2016 questioning the credibility of the election, in many cases without accurate and proper information. Donald Trump's reaction in 2020, completely inappropriate again. So I think that's driven a lot of it. Two pieces of good news. Right? One, here in New Hampshire, we do it right. Congressman Sweat talked about the locality of the election, the use of paper ballots, and the way we approach it. We do it right. Public confidence is relatively high here in New Hampshire. And second, across the country, public officials, election officials are better prepared than ever to deal with some of these issues, having gone through the last 4, 8, 12 years. I think they're going to be more responsive, the monitoring will be better, the communication will be better, and that results in a higher public confidence.
All right, Senator, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate having
Thanks,
you back.
Adam.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll be right back with a discussion on the new voting law taking effect after the November election. Stay with us.